Welcome viewers. You are about to hear a captivating tale, written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. In this haunting mystery, a celebrated artist's final masterpiece holds the key to a deadly secret. Don't forget to subscribe. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, the murderer who painted clues. The soft hum of the carriage wheels echoed through the mist as Sherlock Holmes, draped in his long dark coat, surveyed the city's dark streets. The evening fog clung to the cobblestones, wrapping the entire scene in an eerie stillness. As the carriage approached the Grand Art Gallery, a building of imposing grandeur with tall marble columns and towering windows, Holmes felt the weight of the evening's tension settle around him. He was far from eager, but there was a certain anticipation in his chest, a familiar thrill. This, after all, was his domain, where logic and observation merged into the art of deduction. Dr. Watson sat across from him, gazing out of the window, lost in thought. His companion's broad shoulders were tense, the earlier excitement over dinner still flickering in his eyes. "Holmes," Watson began, his voice low, "do you suppose this exhibition will reveal anything unusual? There's talk about Montague's final piece, rumors that it may well be his last." Sherlock did not look away from the slowly growing structure ahead. "If it is his last, it will not be by choice, Watson. Montague's obsession with his art has led him into shadows where only secrets reside. I have little doubt that there will be something more to his departure than meets the eye." As they disembarked from the carriage, Holmes took in the imposing beauty of the gallery. Gleaming white marble and polished bronze sculptures adorning the entryway, the quiet hum of conversation inside the gallery echoed faintly through the doors. With one hand tucked into the inside pocket of his coat, Holmes adjusted his gloves with deliberate calm. His eye scanned the surrounding crowd, looking for anything out of place, though with so many individuals present, nothing seemed immediately amiss. The grand chandelier above shimmered with the glow of hundreds of candles, casting soft shadows over the guests below. The air smelled of expensive perfume, the faint scent of oil paints mixed with the delicate fragrance of flowers scattered on the tables. Holmes' eyes moved across the room, alighting on the familiar faces of those who made up the upper echelon of the art world. It was Clara Montague, however, who caught his attention first. She stood near the far wall, speaking with a group of distinguished guests, but there was a palpable tension in her movements. She was, without question, a woman of grace, tall, slender, with an aristocratic air about her. But there was something else beneath the surface. The slightest tremor in her hands as she adjusted her shawl, the tightness around her mouth as she smiled, and the quick, almost furtive glance over her shoulder told Holmes that something weighed heavily on her. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. Dr. Watson, ever the social one, was already approaching a group of guests. Holmes, however, did not move immediately. He simply stood in the entrance, observing. There was a peculiar energy in the air, thick and almost tangible. He could feel it in his bones. An undercurrent of something not quite right. The gleaming walls, the sparkling guests, the grand displays of art, they were all mere distractions from the reality that there were forces at work here that Holmes could not yet name. After a moment, Holmes made his way through the crowded gallery with purposeful steps. His eyes never stopped moving, scanning the room for hidden patterns, subtle shifts in behavior, and, most importantly, clues. Watson had found a group to talk to, leaving Holmes alone to do what he did best: observe. He could feel the stares of curious onlookers who recognized him, and the whispered excitement that followed in his wake. Yet, as always, his mind remained focused, sharp, unaffected by the distraction. In the far corner of the room, an older man, his face gaunt and eyes sharp, caught Holmes's gaze. The man's presence was magnetic, though not in the conventional sense of charisma. It was a quiet intensity that only those accustomed to the darker side of human nature would recognize. Montague's closest rival, Reginald Harrow. His eyes locked with Holmes's for a moment, and Holmes could see the glint of resentment there, though it was quickly masked by a forced smile. Holmes turned his attention back to the painting displays making note of each piece with methodical precision, but his mind kept returning to Clara Montague and the artist's rival. Something, perhaps several somethings, was at play in this room beyond the superficial glamour of art and society. Holmes' thoughts were interrupted by a quiet murmur from the crowd. It was then that the doors to the back room opened, and a woman, clearly distressed, hurried past Holmes. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. As she passed, Holmes caught the faintest glimmer of panic in her gaze, and instinctively he moved closer to the door she had just exited. Watson's voice called out to him from across the room, but Holmes remained focused, his eyes narrowed. There was a shifting in the air now, a tension that had begun to rise, something darker and more pressing than the mere art on display. Holmes's mind raced as he stepped forward, his senses heightened. Tonight the game would begin. Holmes moved towards the back room, the crowd murmuring behind him, their voices a dull hum beneath the sharpness of his thoughts. The gallery's atmosphere had shifted, becoming dense with unspoken tension. He could feel it in the way people clung to their conversations, their gazes darting toward the back as if they knew something he did not. As he reached the doorway, he paused. There, standing just inside, was Clara Montague, her face drained of color, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. She caught sight of him before he could fully step inside, and a fleeting look of recognition passed over her face. She quickly masked it, composing herself with the poise of someone who had perfected the art of hiding emotions. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice soft, trembling slightly despite her best efforts. I did not expect you to be here." "Mrs. Montague," Holmes replied, his voice calm and precise. "It seems there has been an incident, yes?" Clara glanced over her shoulder toward the door behind her, where faint whispers floated into the hallway. "It's nothing," she said, her attempt at reassurance too hollow to be convincing. I was surprised, that's all." Holmes tilted his head slightly, noting her hesitation, the tightness in her posture. There was something more, he could tell, an undercurrent of fear that she was desperate to keep hidden beneath layers of control. He allowed her a moment, observing the slight fidgeting of her hands, the way her fingers pulled nervously at the fabric of her dress. "Mrs. Montague," he began again, his gaze unyielding, "it would be helpful if you could tell me what you know. It appears this is no ordinary exhibition. What has happened here?" She hesitated, looking around as though weighing the words before speaking them aloud. I have no idea what could have gone wrong," she said, the words coming out in a rush as if she could hardly stop herself. "The painting. It was meant to be a masterpiece, a reflection of my husband's genius. But now everything has turned to ruin." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "The painting. And your husband, where is he now?" She turned away, her eyes catching something just out of view, perhaps a figure in the shadows. Or perhaps she was merely avoiding his gaze. "I haven't seen him since earlier. He was with some of the other artists, I think. But I've been so distracted. His work, his obsession has been wearing him thin." Holmes absorbed her words, her uneasy tone, and the odd way she stumbled through the sentences. The painting, Montague's obsession, the missing artist, it all pointed to a deeper story, one laced with anxiety, isolation, and perhaps fear. Clara's lips pressed together tightly, her brow furrowed with confusion and worry, and Holmes felt the weight of something unsaid in the air. "Your husband's work is clearly of great importance to you, Mrs. Montague," Holmes said, his voice almost too soft. "But I sense that there is something more at play here. The tension in this room, it's not merely about art. I would suggest you take a moment to consider if there's anything, any small detail, that might help illuminate what has happened." Clara seemed to shrink under his scrutiny, the mask of composure cracking ever so slightly. For a moment she looked at him, eyes searching his, as if measuring his intentions. Finally she sighed, as though resigning herself to something unspoken. "You're right," she said quietly. "I can't hide it any longer. Please, Mr. Holmes, you must understand. This isn't just a matter of art. It's far more complicated." Before Holmes could respond, a voice from behind him interrupted. "Is there something I can help with?" The voice was cold, clipped, and unmistakably familiar. Holmes turned, meeting the sharp eyes of Reginald Harrow. The artist's presence was commanding, his posture rigid, his gaze intense. "I am sorry to interrupt," Harrow continued, his voice carrying an edge that was both mocking and concerned. "But I couldn't help but overhear. What is it you're investigating, Mr. Holmes? Surely Mrs. Montague needs no assistance from a detective at this hour." Clara stiffened, the tension between her and Harrow palpable, and Holmes noted the subtle, quick shift in her expression. There was history here, a history of rivalry, unspoken resentments. Harrow's eyes flicked from Clara to Holmes, his lips curling into the faintest of sneers. Holmes remained unfazed, his mind already working, piecing together the dynamic between the two. Harrow's tone was too casual, his attitude too indifferent for someone who, in all likelihood, was a suspect in the broader scheme of things. "I'm merely offering my services to Mrs. Montague," Holmes replied smoothly. "There seems to be something that both of you are avoiding, something connected to the missing artist." Harrow's smile tightened at the edges, his gaze flicking over Holmes with a knowing look. "Montague is no mystery to me, Mr. Holmes. His works, his methods, they've all been laid bare in the public eye. It's no surprise his final piece is causing quite a stir." His eyes turned toward Clara, and for the briefest of moments there was a flicker of something unreadable between them. "But I see now that perhaps you have more at stake than mere art, Mrs. Montague." Clara's face paled further, her lips parting as if to speak, but the words failed her. The silence between them was thick, and Holmes sensed that this confrontation was just the beginning. The tension between the two artists, one alive with ambition, the other consumed by obsession, was evident. It was a volatile mixture, and Holmes could see it would be key to understanding the situation at hand. "I trust," Holmes said, his voice cutting through the uneasy silence, "that you'll both assist me in uncovering what has truly occurred here. This gallery holds more than art. It holds a puzzle, one I'm determined to solve." The door to the back room opened, the soft creak of the hinges cutting through the growing tension. Holmes stepped forward, his sharp gaze sweeping the area as he entered the dimly lit space. The faint scent of oil paint lingered in the air, mingling with the dry, almost metallic tang of blood. As he moved further inside, his mind homed in on the central focus of the room, the canvas that had once been Montague's final creation. The painting was no longer the masterpiece it was meant to be. Its vibrant colors were smeared, the bold strokes now jagged, chaotic, utterly unrecognizable. The blood, fresh and stark against the faded paint, ran in thin rivulets down the side of the canvas, pooling in the crevices of the frame. A clear handprint, dark and red, marred the surface, as if someone had tried to steady themselves against the work itself, only to find it slipping from their grasp. Holmes stepped closer, his mind racing, absorbing the scene. He reached for the note that rested near the base of the frame. Its edges crinkled, the ink still fresh. The handwriting was hurried, jagged, emotions reflected in each stroke of the pen. The painter paints in more than colors. The words hung in the air, cryptic and laden with meaning. His brow furrowed as he read them again, his mind instinctively making connections. There was a message here, not just in the act of defacing the painting, but in the very words that had been left behind. Holmes could sense the deliberate nature of the act. This was no random act of vandalism, it was personal, a statement, a clue in itself. Behind him, Watson entered the room, his face pale as he took in the scene. The doctor's breath caught in his throat and he instinctively stepped back, his hand brushing against the doorframe for balance. "Good God, Holmes! What on earth happened here?" Holmes did not turn around, but continued to study the painting, his voice steady. "It's clear that someone wanted to send a message, Watson, and judging by the blood, it's not just the painting that's been damaged." Watson stepped closer, eyes widening as he followed Holmes's gaze. The blood was not only on the canvas, but smeared across the floor in a wide arc, leading away toward the far corner of the room. There a figure lay motionless, a man, dressed in the unmistakable attire of a wealthy artist. his face pale and lifeless. "It's Montague," Watson murmured, the realization settling in like a cold stone in his stomach. Holmes moved quickly, kneeling beside the body. His gloved fingers brushed lightly against Montague's wrist, searching for a pulse that was no longer there. His face remained impassive, betraying none of the shock that might have overtaken another in this situation. Instead, his eyes narrowed, observing the scene with clinical precision. "There's no sign of struggle," Holmes murmured, his voice betraying nothing of the storm that raged inside him. "The position of the body suggests he was already dead before the painting was defaced, and yet the blood on the canvas is still fresh, as though the act of painting was interrupted." Watson watched, his face pale as he looked from Montague's body to the chaotic splatters on the painting. "But how? Who could have done this? And why?" Holmes stood slowly, his gaze sweeping the room. He took in the pristine condition of the rest of the space. Nothing else had been disturbed, no other signs of violence. It was as if someone had entered, committed the murder, and then left, all without disturbing anything beyond the immediate area around the painting. "There is something deliberate about this," Holmes said slowly, his tone distant as he processed the clues. "Montague was the target, not the painting itself. Someone wanted to make a statement, to leave behind more than just a murder." Holmes stood, turning to face Watson, his mind already racing through the possible scenarios. "The note, the blood, the position of the body, all of it points to one thing. This was planned. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. The painting wasn't just a victim of rage, it was part of the crime, part of the message." Watson's eyes darted nervously across the room, his gaze landing on the door. The gallery, with its lavish walls and expensive art, seemed to mock the gruesome nature of the crime. But who would do something like this? And why? Holmes's lips tightened, a glint of understanding flashing in his eyes. He turned back toward the body, crouching down once more, this time to inspect Montague's pockets. As his fingers brushed against the fabric of the artist's coat, something small and folded caught his attention. He pulled it free, unfolding a thin, crumpled piece of paper. The handwriting on it was faint, barely legible, but the words were unmistakable. "The truth lies within the art, and you will never find it." Holmes stood abruptly, the paper clutched in his hand. The mystery was growing deeper, more convoluted with each passing moment. There were answers here, hidden beneath layers of art, jealousy, and deceit. But the question remained: who would kill an artist, destroy his final work, and then leave behind riddles to be solved? "Watson," Holmes said quietly, his voice calm despite the complexity of the case. "We're only beginning to uncover the truth, and I suspect that Montague's final work was never meant to be a simple painting." Holmes stood still for a moment, his mind carefully running through the implications of what he had just discovered. The faint crackling of the fireplace in the corner of the room was the only sound that broke the silence, as Watson stood by, still processing the murder and its chaotic aftermath. Holmes had not moved from the body, his eyes scanning the room, absorbing every detail with a calculating precision. "Holmes," Watson said quietly, stepping forward, his voice tinged with urgency. "What do you make of the note? The words Montague left behind. They must mean something. Could it be a clue?" Holmes turned to Watson, his expression unreadable. "The note is not merely a message, Watson. It's a key, part of a much larger puzzle. It's clear Montague knew something that led to his death. Whoever murdered him wanted the world to know that there was more to this than just a tragic act of violence." Watson nodded, although his brow remained furrowed in confusion. "But how can we uncover the meaning behind these words? The truth lies within the art. What art, Holmes? And what truth?" Before Holmes could respond, his gaze flicked back to the defaced painting. The bold strokes, the splashes of red, the careful, deliberate positioning of the blood, all of it carried a deeper message. But what? He took a few steps toward the canvas, observing it again from a different angle, as if the painting itself might reveal more through his concentrated scrutiny. "There's something off about the way the blood mingles with the paint," Holmes murmured to himself. "It's too clean, too controlled." This was no violent outburst. It was carefully calculated. Whoever did this wanted the blood to merge with the painting, to stain it permanently. They wanted it to be seen, to remain. He straightened and turned back toward Watson. "I'll need to speak with those who were closest to Montague in the hours leading up to his death. The painting was meant to be his final declaration. There's no doubt about it. But why would someone go to such lengths to destroy it, yet preserve a portion of it in a way that demands attention?" "His wife," Watson said thoughtfully. "She must know something. She was one of the last to speak with him before the exhibition opened. She must have seen something, or at least she might have noticed something unusual." Holmes gave a brief nod. "We will start with her, Watson. But we must also speak to the others, the ones who were closest to Montague, both in art and in life. We need to gather as much information as we can before we make any conclusions. The answer lies in the people around him. It always does." Watson's eyes lingered on the body for a moment longer before turning to follow Holmes as he moved toward the exit of the back room. Holmes stepped lightly, as if the floor itself might reveal some hidden clue beneath its polished surface. The gallery was eerily quiet now, the hum of conversation and the faint clinking of glasses long gone. As they made their way toward the front of the gallery, Holmes scanned the room for any faces that stood out, any small detail that might reveal a clue. Clara Montague was still among the guests, though she now stood at the far end of the room, speaking with several others, her face drawn and pale. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her shawl, her posture too stiff, too controlled. It was clear she had not yet fully processed the gravity of the situation. Or perhaps there was more that she was trying to conceal. "Stay close," Holmes whispered to Watson, nodding toward Clara. "Let's approach her with care." As they moved closer, Holmes' attention flicked to the door near the back of the room, where Reginald Harrow was now standing, his arms crossed over his chest, watching them with a calculating gaze. The artist's sharp features were set in a cold expression, and Holmes could see the subtle way Harrow tensed at the sight of him. There was a familiarity between them, Holmes realized. Harrow had always been a figure of quiet bitterness in the art world, and now that bitterness was aimed directly at the Montagues. Holmes took a deep breath, readying himself for the next step in his investigation. They would need answers, and not just from Clara, but from everyone connected to Montague. Each person here had their own version of events, their own set of motives and secrets, and as always, it was the smallest detail, the smallest slip of the tongue, that would reveal the truth. Watson stepped beside him, his expression a mix of confusion and resolve. "Do you think Clara will talk to us, Holmes? She seems distraught." Holmes looked toward Clara once more, noting the rigidity in her movements. "She will talk, Watson, but we must tread carefully. The truth is often hidden behind the most polished of facades." As they approached her, Holmes felt the growing weight of the investigation settle upon him, each step bringing them closer to understanding Montague's final tragic hours. Yet, even as he moved closer, his mind kept returning to the painting, the artist's final masterpiece, and the secret it might hold. Holmes and Watson made their way across the gallery floor, the tension in the air thick as the crowd began to murmur with unease. The sense of an unseen force shifting was undeniable. The whispers that had previously been murmurs of anticipation for the exhibition were now hushed and uncertain. Every face seemed to harbor its own set of suspicions, and Holmes couldn't help but note the subtle undercurrent of fear that seemed to sweep through the guests. Holmes's first instinct was always to observe. He studied Clara Montague from a distance, watching her as she interacted with others, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of unease, as her gaze darted toward him and Watson. Her posture had become more rigid, her composure faltering with each passing second. She looked like a woman caught between two worlds, the facade she tried to maintain and the stark reality of what had just unfolded. Dr. Watson, ever the tactician when it came to handling delicate matters, leaned closer to Holmes, his voice low. "Do you think she'll tell us anything useful, Holmes? Her demeanor suggests she's not quite herself. Perhaps it's grief, or something else entirely." Holmes didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on Clara, noting the way she fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve, the subtle twitch in her mouth as she conversed with the gallery's curator, a tall, bespectacled man named Bernard Fairchild. The man spoke with animated gestures, but Clara barely acknowledged him, her eyes constantly shifting between the conversation and the door leading to the back room. She was avoiding them, but Holmes could sense that she wasn't ready to hide the truth just yet. Without a word, Holmes guided Watson through the crowd, weaving toward Clara. When they were within a few paces of her, Holmes cleared his throat softly, just loud enough to catch her attention. She stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line, before turning to face them. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she greeted them, though the effort to sound composed was apparent in her voice. "I assume you've seen the state of the gallery, and the work. I can't quite fathom how something like this could happen." Holmes, standing with his usual grace, said nothing at first, his gaze never leaving her face. Her expression was guarded, but not enough to conceal the flicker of fear that appeared and disappeared in her eyes. Holmes knew that under pressure, people often revealed more than they intended. "Mrs. Montague," Holmes began, his voice even, "you were among the last to see your husband before the painting was unveiled. Can you tell me anything about his state of mind? Was there anything unusual about his behavior in the hours leading up to this event?" Clara's hand trembled slightly as she clasped it to her chest, her gaze flitting toward the back room once more before she returned it to Holmes. The slight hesitation before she spoke did not go unnoticed. "My husband was distracted, that's all. He'd been working on the painting for days, weeks even, but his obsession had grown and, well, he began to talk about things that I didn't quite understand. He became convinced that his work was more than just art. It was a message, something that would change everything." Her voice dropped lower, almost as if she feared someone might overhear. Holmes leaned in slightly, his interest piqued. "A message? What kind of message?" Clara hesitated again, her fingers twisting the fabric of her shawl. She glanced over her shoulder nervously before answering, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. "I don't know what he meant. He would speak in riddles as if the painting itself would reveal the truth. He was consumed by it, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed it was just the artist in him, the madness of creating something new." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, piecing together the fragments of her words. Her reluctance to speak further was telling, but there was something in her tone, something about the way she tried to brush off the seriousness of her husband's state that caught his attention. "And how was he the night before?" Watson asked, stepping forward. "Was there anything that seemed out of place?" Clara bit her lip, her gaze shifting between Watson and Holmes. He was restless. He didn't sleep well. He kept muttering about something that would happen when the painting was revealed. Something terrible. He said the world would see what he had seen, something hidden in plain sight. Holmes absorbed her words carefully, noting the unsettling nature of Montague's premonitions. There was something deeper here, something far darker than just the artist's obsessive tendencies. And did he share these thoughts with anyone else, perhaps a colleague or someone who might have had a reason to disrupt his work? Clara looked down, her fingers knotting the fabric of her shawl tighter. "No, no one else. I don't think so," she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. "He kept to himself mostly, aside from the rivalries he had with other artists, but nothing more, nothing serious." A long silence stretched between them as Holmes's gaze sharpened, analyzing every subtle gesture, every change in her demeanor. Clara's responses were evasive, and her desire to hide something was becoming more apparent with every word. Holmes nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mrs. Montague. This information is invaluable. I believe we've learned something crucial here." He paused, his eyes locking with hers. "But I sense that there is more to this than what you've said." I trust you will speak openly with me soon. The truth can be elusive, but it will surface." Clara's expression faltered briefly, and for the first time a flicker of regret passed through her eyes. "I want to help," she whispered, barely audible, "but I can't, not yet." As she turned away, her eyes lingering on the back door once more, Holmes exchanged a look with Watson. There was far more to uncover here. They were only scratching the surface. Holmes and Watson moved through the gallery, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air between them. Clara Montague's words had unsettled them both, her hesitation, her avoidance. It was clear that she was hiding something. But what? As they made their way toward the entrance, Holmes's sharp eyes caught sight of Reginald Harrow once more. The artist was standing by a group of admirers, a glass of wine in his hand, his posture rigid and detached. There was something about his demeanor, the way he held himself apart from the others, that struck Holmes as odd. It was as though Harrow were watching the proceedings with too much interest, his eyes too focused on every movement, every subtle shift in the room. "Watson, I believe it's time we speak with Mr. Harrow," Holmes said, his voice low but firm. "I've observed his reactions, and I suspect he knows more than he's letting on." Watson looked hesitant. "Holmes, do you think Harrow is involved in this? He doesn't seem the type." Holmes's gaze never wavered from the artist. "Appearances can be deceiving, Watson. Harrow may be an artist, but he is not above the motivations of jealousy, ambition, or revenge. He is tied to Montague in ways that go beyond professional rivalry. I believe he has something to hide." As they approached Harrow, the murmur of voices around them quieted for a moment, and the artist turned to face them. His features were as sharp as ever, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, something that suggested discomfort, though it was well concealed. He set down his glass with deliberate care before speaking. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Harrow greeted them coolly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Holmes offered a thin smile, one that barely touched his eyes. "Mr. Harrow, we were hoping to speak with you about your relationship with the late Alistair Montague. It's clear from your interactions this evening that you two had a complicated connection." Harrow's lips curled slightly, as though amused by the suggestion. "Complicated? Perhaps. I've always had a deep appreciation for Montague's work, but you know as well as I do that artists are often at odds. Rivalry is a natural part of our profession." Holmes stepped closer, his voice dropping lower. "Rivalry, yes, but this goes beyond mere competition, doesn't it, Mr. Harrow? The painting, the blood, the cryptic messages, it seems more personal than a simple artistic rivalry. Tell me, did Montague's obsession with his final work make him any enemy?" Harrow's eyes flicked to the side, an almost imperceptible glance toward the door leading to the back room. His fingers tightened around the edge of his glass. For a moment Holmes could almost hear the wheels turning in Harrow's mind, weighing his options. Then, as though deciding that silence would be more damning, Harrow spoke. "Montague was a fool," he said quietly, his voice laced with disdain. "His obsession consumed him, and he couldn't see beyond his own art. I've seen it before, Holmes. He started believing his work would change the world, that it would reveal some hidden truth that no one else could understand. The man was mad with it." Holmes studied Harrow's face carefully, noting the slight tremor in his voice, the rigid set of his jaw. "And you, Mr. Harrow? What did you believe? Did you think the same? Or were you jealous?" Harrow's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Jealous? Of Montague? Please. He was no more a genius than the rest of us, just another artist with an inflated sense of self-worth." Holmes's gaze sharpened as he caught the flicker of something behind Harrow's words, something that rang false. "Yet you were the one who was closest to Montague, were you not? You had access to his studio, his works, his thoughts. You knew more about him than anyone else here. Tell me, Mr. Harrow, did you ever speak to him about his final painting? Did he share anything peculiar with you before his death?" Harrow hesitated, a brief, fleeting moment where his mask slipped. His eyes darted to the floor, and Holmes noted the way his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, the subtle signs of guilt or fear. It was enough to make Holmes press further. He didn't speak much about it, no, Harrow said, his voice now clipped, almost defensive. He became obsessed with it, yes, but he wouldn't let anyone near it. He was protective of his work, perhaps too protective. If you ask me, that was the problem. He alienated everyone around him, even those who tried to understand. Holmes studied him for a moment longer before responding. You are, of course, suggesting that Montague's obsession led him to alienate others. But let me ask you this, Mr. Harrow. Why would someone go to such extremes to destroy a work of art unless they were trying to hide something? Perhaps Montague's final piece held more than just artistic value. Perhaps it held the key to something else. Harrow's gaze flickered again, and for the first time, a trace of doubt crossed his face. He took a quick step back, as though the conversation had turned too uncomfortable, too close to something he wanted to avoid. I don't know what you're getting at, Holmes, he said, his voice suddenly cold. All I know is that Montague's work was his obsession. It was his to keep, and now it's ruined. I suggest you find the person responsible for that, not me. Holmes's lips tightened into a thin line as he studied Harrow. There was no denying it now. Harrow was hiding something. Whether it was guilt, resentment, or fear, Holmes wasn't yet sure. But the artist's carefully crafted mask was slipping, revealing cracks that pointed to a deeper involvement. As Harrow moved away, his back straight and stiff, Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson. The tension between them had grown palpable, and as Holmes watched Harrow retreat into the crowd, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to the heart of the mystery, closer to the secret Montague had been hiding. The night had settled in deep, and the gallery, once alive with the quiet murmur of polite conversation, now stood in somber silence. Holmes, having excused himself from the mingling guests, had retreated to a quiet corner of the gallery, his mind whirring as he sifted through the events of the evening. Watson stood by the window, gazing out into the night, though his attention was equally divided between the puzzle Holmes was piecing together and the unease that clung to the atmosphere. Holmes's hands rested lightly on the edge of a table, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of a leather-bound notebook. His brow furrowed as he turned the pieces of the puzzle over in his mind. The pieces were all there, each clue, each contradiction, each discarded hint. Yet, the full picture remained frustratingly out of reach. Holmes, Watson began, his voice breaking the stillness. You seem lost in thought. What's troubling you? Holmes's gaze never wavered from the papers in front of him. It is the pattern, Watson. It's all here. Clara Montague's behavior, Harrow's evasiveness, the bloodied canvas and the cryptic message left behind. But there is more beneath the surface, something deeper at play. Montague's obsession, his final words, the secrecy surrounding his work. All of it was leading to something. Holmes paused, tapping his fingers on the edge of the notebook, his thoughts continuing to race. He could hear the faint sounds of the distant chatter from the gallery's main room, but it was like a distant hum, irrelevant in the moment. His mind was consumed with the facts before him. He leaned forward, his voice quiet but certain. Consider Montague's final painting, Watson. It was not simply destroyed, it was violated. Whoever did this, they were making a statement, a deliberate, calculated statement. The blood was not accidental. It was an integral part of the crime, a symbolic gesture. Watson stepped forward, glancing at the papers Holmes had laid out on the table, scraps of notes, bits of evidence they had gathered. You think the blood was meant to communicate something? Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the pages. Precisely. This was no mindless act of violence. Montague's final work, his last masterpiece, was more than a mere reflection of his artistic abilities. It was a key to something much more sinister. He stood suddenly, the movement sharp and decisive. And then there's the note. The painter paints in more than colours. That was not meant as a riddle, Watson. It was a clue, a warning. Montague was aware that his work was not simply art, but a message. And that message, I believe, ties back to something much darker than anyone realizes. He turned to Watson, his gaze intense. You remember Harrow's words, don't you? The man was mad with it. That statement was not just a judgment. It was a reflection of Harrow's own insecurities. He envied Montague's vision, and that jealousy may have driven him to do far more than criticize. Watson frowned, his mind working through the pieces of the theory Holmes was weaving. You think Harrow may have had something to do with Montague's death? Holmes smiled, though it was more of a thin line of determination than a full expression of amusement. Not just Harrow, Watson. We have to look at everyone involved. Clara, Harrow, Price, and even those who stand to gain from Montague's death. The painting, the blood, the note, all these elements point to one thing. Montague was not killed simply for his art. He was killed to keep something hidden, something that someone didn't want the world to see. He paced around the room, his footsteps slow but deliberate, as if he were walking through the very thoughts that danced in his mind. The symbol in the final piece, the one that Montague was obsessed with. Could it have been a key, a code? What if the truth Montague was revealing wasn't just a message about art, but a message about something hidden in plain sight? Watson, now more intrigued than ever, turned to Holmes, his brow furrowed. You think Montague's last work had more than just artistic value? You think it was meant to reveal something else? Holmes stopped pacing and turned toward his friend. Yes, Watson, I believe Montague's obsession was not just with the art itself, but with what it symbolized. This painting was the culmination of years of hidden truths, family secrets, betrayals. And now, someone is doing everything they can to bury it, to keep the truth from coming to light. Holmes's voice softened, but the sharpness in his eyes remained. Someone is willing to kill to protect this secret, and we need to uncover it before more lives are lost. He turned back toward the table, his eyes scanning the scraps of paper and notes once more, his mind now racing with a clarity that had been lacking before. He could see the threads of the mystery unraveling before him, each piece leading him closer to the truth. But there was one final piece missing, one last revelation that would tie everything together. We're close, Watson, Holmes murmured, more to himself than to his companion. We're closer than we've ever been. The air in the gallery grew thick as Holmes and Watson made their way toward the center of the room, where the final confrontation would take place. Holmes's mind was sharp, each step they took now resonating with the knowledge that the pieces were falling into place. The last few hours had been a whirlwind of questions, contradictions, and false leads. But the conclusion was clear now. It was time for the truth to surface. Holmes paused briefly, scanning the room. The evening had transformed from a celebration of art into a chamber of secrets, and the gathered guests, the suspects, the bystanders, the guilty, were all a part of this intricate web that was finally beginning to unravel. In the center of it all stood Clara Montague, her face pale, eyes hollow with uncertainty. Beside her, Reginald Harrow stood like a silent sentinel, his gaze unwavering, his posture stiff. A small group of art critics, curators, and patrons watched from a distance, their murmurs barely audible. Holmes felt a flicker of unease as his eyes flicked over the guests. They were all here, but there was something in their presence, something in the tension between them, that suggested one of them was hiding something far more dangerous than mere professional rivalry. Holmes, Watson said quietly, his voice full of anticipation. I think it's time. Holmes nodded but remained silent, his gaze fixed. This was the moment he had been preparing for. The time had come to reveal the truth, to confront the murderer, to pull the threads together. Ladies and gentlemen, Holmes's voice rang out clearly, cutting through the quiet murmur of the crowd. His gaze swept over them, briefly settling on each of the key players, the two artists, the grieving wife, the art dealer, and the critics. I have gathered you here tonight for one reason and one reason only, to reveal the truth behind the death of Alistair Montague. A wave of uneasy murmurs rippled through the crowd, and Clara's face tightened, her eyes flicking nervously to Harrow. The gallery's bright light suddenly felt harsh, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the room. Holmes's gaze locked with Clara's, his voice steady but sharp. "Mrs. Montague, your husband's final work was more than just art. It was a message, a key to something much darker, and someone here tonight was desperate to keep that truth from being revealed." Clara's eyes widened as Holmes stepped closer, his expression a mixture of sympathy and unwavering resolve. But it wasn't just about protecting Montague's secret. It was about control over something far greater than just a painting. The crowd shifted, restless as the room seemed to shrink around them. Holmes took a deep breath, his gaze shifting from Clara to Harrow. The man who did this, who destroyed Montague's final work, was someone who had more to gain from silencing him than anyone could have imagined. He turned to Harrow, his voice now colder, more cutting. "Reginald Harrow, you were the one who stood to gain from Montague's death. You envied his success, resented his genius, and you knew that if his final work was revealed to the world, it would cast a shadow over everything you'd ever achieved." Harrow's face, usually so composed, shifted for the first time. His lips pressed tightly together, and his hands clenched at his sides. "You're wrong, Holmes," he said through gritted teeth. "You don't know what you're talking about. I had no reason to kill him." Holmes's eyes never left Harrow's face as he continued. "Oh, but you did. Montague's obsession was not only with his art, it was with his beliefs, his vision. And you knew that his final piece would expose the truth, the same truth you feared." The tension in the room was palpable, and Holmes could feel the weight of the eyes upon him as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. He turned back to Clara, his gaze softening only slightly. "But you, Mrs. Montague, you knew the truth too, didn't you? You knew that your husband's obsession was not just with his art, but with something far darker, something hidden in his past." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Holmes stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You tried to protect him. You tried to shield him from the consequences of his actions, but in doing so, you played a part in this tragedy." Clara's face crumpled, the grief and guilt that had been buried deep within her now rising to the surface. She collapsed into a chair, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. "I never meant for this to happen," she whispered. "I never wanted him to die. I only wanted to protect him from what he had uncovered." Holmes's gaze softened as he turned away from her and faced the others in the room. Montague's work was not just art. It was a map, a code. It revealed the truth about a dangerous web of deceit, a conspiracy that stretched beyond the gallery and into the very fabric of the art world itself. And someone here tonight, someone very close to him, was determined to ensure that the truth would never be revealed. The room fell into an eerie silence, and Holmes stood tall, his mind working through the final piece of the puzzle. He stepped forward once more, his eyes sweeping over the gathered crowd. It was not just Harrow's jealousy, nor Clara's desperate attempts to protect her husband, Holmes said, his voice steady yet carrying an undeniable weight. It was Gerald Price, the art dealer, who had the most to lose from Montague's final piece. Price was involved in illegal dealings, funneling stolen art and using Montague's fame to cover his tracks. Montague's painting, the last one he ever created, held a hidden message, a message that would have exposed everything. Holmes turned sharply to Price, whose face had gone pale, his hand instinctively clutching at his coat. "You thought you could bury it all, didn't you, Mr. Price? But Montague's final work was too dangerous, too revealing, and so you decided to silence him." The room was still as Holmes's words sank in. Gerald Price, caught in the glaring light of revelation, stood frozen, his eyes darting between Holmes, Clara, and the others in the room. The gallery was still, the echoes of Holmes's revelation lingering in the air like a heavy fog. The once vibrant atmosphere, full of murmurs and the faint clink of glasses, had quieted into a hushed reverence. The guests stood motionless, each one processing the unfolding drama in their own way. The truth, so carefully hidden, had now emerged, and the ripples of that truth were undeniable. Holmes stood at the center of it all, his face a mask of calm, but his eyes revealed the quiet storm of thoughts that swirled in his mind. Watson, ever his companion, stood beside him, though his gaze flickered between the assembled crowd and the scene unfolding before them. There was no victory in Holmes's stance, only a quiet acknowledgement that the case had been solved, but that the cost was far greater than anyone had imagined. Clara Montague, her face pale and streaked with tears, sat slumped in a chair, her hands trembling in her lap. The weight of the truth seemed to suffocate her, and her sobs were soft but sharp, echoing in the otherwise silent room. She had played a role in this tragedy, trying to shield her husband, but the consequences of that protection had been far more devastating than she could have ever anticipated. Price stood rigid, his eyes darting nervously around the room. It was clear that his attempts to bury the truth had failed. His ties to the underground world of stolen art had been exposed, his involvement in Montier's death now irrefutable. His face was ashen, his mouth dry, and for the first time he seemed vulnerable. Not the confident, calculating dealer that Holmes had initially seen, but a man on the edge of collapse. Harrow, on the other hand, had retreated to the farthest corner of the room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face expressionless. There was no sign of guilt or remorse in his eyes, only a cold, almost disdainful calm. It was clear to Holmes that Harrow's motives had been driven by more than just artistic rivalry. There had been a deeper, more personal resentment, but it was the lies and deceit that had truly sealed Montague's fate. Holmes moved towards the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the guilty and the innocent alike. He could feel the weight of their eyes upon him, waiting for him to deliver the final words, to tie up the loose ends of the narrative he had so meticulously crafted. Montague, Holmes began, his voice low, almost reverent, was more than just an artist. He was a man with a vision that was both a gift and a curse. He believed that art could reveal the truth, but in doing so he became the very target of the forces that wanted that truth kept hidden. Holmes turned to Clara, his eyes softening ever so slightly. "You sought to protect your husband, Mrs. Montague. You wanted to shield him from the consequences of his obsession, but in doing so, you became part of the web of deceit that ultimately led to his death." Clara's eyes met Holmes's, and for a moment there was a flicker of understanding between them, an acknowledgement of the complexity of her actions. She had been both victim and accomplice, and now, as the truth lay bare before her, the enormity of that truth threatened to consume her. Holmes's gaze shifted to Price, who had not yet spoken. The art dealer's silence spoke volumes. He had been caught in a web of lies, but the most damning truth remained. His greed had driven him to destroy not just a man, but the very legacy Montague had created. "You thought you could control the narrative, Mr. Price," Holmes said coldly, "but you failed. Montague's work was not yours to manipulate, nor was his death yours to orchestrate." Price's lips parted, but no words came out. His eyes shifted nervously, and for a moment he seemed small, insignificant. His empire of stolen art and hidden secrets had crumbled in an instant, and the once imposing figure was now reduced to a man facing the consequences of his actions. "And you," Holmes continued, turning his gaze on Harrow, "your rivalry with Montague was real, but it was not the root of this tragedy. It was your inability to accept his vision, to see beyond your own ego, that made you the willing accomplice in this crime. You may have resented him, but it was your silence and your complicity that sealed his fate." Harrow stood motionless, his face unreadable. There was no anger in his eyes, no admission of guilt. He simply stood watching as Holmes dismantled the false narratives that had once protected him. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant sound of the city beyond the gallery's windows. The weight of the truth had settled, and the finality of it was both undeniable and irreversible. Holmes turned to Watson, his face softening for a moment as he met his companion's gaze. "It is over, Watson. The truth has been revealed." Watson nodded, his expression somber. "And what of them, Holmes? What happens now?" Holmes's gaze swept over the gathered guests once more. "Now, They will face the consequences of their actions. Justice, however it is delivered, will be their final reckoning. Holmes paused for a moment, the weight of his own thoughts pulling him inward. There were no easy answers in this case, no simple victories. The murder had been solved, but the scars left behind would linger, both for those who had died and for those who had lived with their secrets. The gallery, once a place of beauty and light, had become a mausoleum for the truths that had been buried too long. And now, as the last whispers of the night faded, Holmes allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. The puzzle had been solved, but the cost of that solution, of unveiling the hidden truths, was something that would stay with him far beyond this night.